I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about the second half of the first chapter of the myth of Sisyphus, starting with section 1.3, Philosophical Suicide. The feeling of the absurd is not the notion of the absurd, writes Camus. We might feel the absurdity of life, but this does not alone constitute a concept or a theory. It is instead the impetus to develop a theory of the absurd. The feeling, however, is not restricted by whatever our theories may say about it. Camus examines Karl Jasper's, Lev Chestov, Soren Kierkegaard, and Husserl's theories regarding the absurd in this section. He begins by thinking about how we commonly understand the absurd. We declare something is absurd when it clashes with our expectations of how things should be. The degree of absurdity is in direct proportion to the distance between reality and our expectations of it. Facts or phenomena in themselves are not absurd. They just are what they are. Absurdity springs from a comparison. The absurd is not in man, nor in the world, but in their presence together, Camus elaborates. If we take away human beings or the world, one element of his equation or the other, there is no absurdity. If there is no person feeling the sense of absurdity about the world, there is no absurdity. Hence the absurd ends with death. If there is no world, likewise there is no absurdity. The absurd is constituted by the contradiction between people's expectations and the reality of the world. For Camus, the absurd is an essential and foremost truth. As a consequence of its truth, if I judge that a thing is true, I must preserve it, he writes, even if this truth crushes us. A solution where one of the two terms of the equation of the absurd is made to go away is not a solution to him. It would be an avoidance of the problem of the absurd. Instead, we need to confront and struggle against it. To struggle against the problem of the absurd, hope needs to be abandoned since it is a false hope. There needs to be a continual rejection and dissatisfaction with our absurd condition. However, Camus notes that existential philosophies all suggest escape from the absurd condition. Through an odd reasoning starting from the absurd over the ruins of reason, in a closed universe limited to the human, they deify what crushes them and find reason to hope in what impoverizes them, he sums up. Because of the absurd, they invent gods so that they can have hope. Camus thinks of this escape to religion as a leap. Recognizing the absurdity of the world like Camus, Jaspers is likewise unable to find any overarching principle in our experience of the world. Yet without justification, he suddenly asserts all at once the transcendent, the essence of experience, and the superhuman significance of life when he writes, "Does not the failure reveal, beyond any possible explanation and interpretation, not the absence but the existence of transcendence," recalls Camus. Because Jaspers cannot understand, he posits a god to bridge the gap. While Camus does not mention it here, this attitude predates the modern philosopher and has been a reason since antiquity to postulate gods and other supernatural beings to explain gaps in our understanding. It also calls to mind what has been misattributed to Tertullian, I believe because it is absurd. Camus observes of Jaspers, the passion he devotes to asserting God is in direct proportion to the gap between his powers of explanation and the irrationality of the world and of experience. Camus had earlier in this section similarly talked about the sense of absurdity and its directly proportionate relationship to the gap between our expectations of the world and reality. The more absurd things seem, the more urgently we need God. Chestov posits a similar position to Jaspers according to Camus. We turn towards God only to obtain the impossible. As for the possible, man suffice. When Chestov discovers the fundamental absurdity of all existence, he does not say, "This is absurd," but rather, "This is God." Chestov hints that this God is perhaps full of hatred and hateful, incomprehensible and contradictory, notes Camus. The greater the sense of absurdity, the stronger is the proof of God's existence. Chestov suggests an attitude of acceptance towards the absurd, escaping it by placing one's hope in God instead of adopting the attitude of hopelessness and continual struggle that Camus advocates. Camus contrasts his position to Chestov's. To Chestov, reason is useless, but there is something beyond reason. To an absurd mind, reason is useless and there is nothing beyond reason. For Camus, all we can do is reason about our condition, but yet reason cannot help us understand our condition of living in an absurd world. He does not deny reason, which has its order in which it is efficacious. The absurd is born precisely at the very meeting point of the efficacious but limited reason with the ever-resurgent irrational, explains Camus. Reason functions up to a limit after which the world seems irrational, and that limit is where the absurd takes over. Like Jaspers, Chestov is trying to dissolve the first part of Camus' equation. This move to completely eradicate reason by Chestov so as to also eradicate the absurd is to Camus not a legitimate move. It ignores the existence of limits and levels. The laws of nature may be operative up to a certain limit, beyond which they turn against themselves to give birth to the absurd. Or else they may justify themselves on the level of description without being true on the level of explanation, Camus writes. To Camus, the right approach is to recognize the struggle, not absolutely scorn reason and admit the irrational, to embrace in a single glance all the data of experience, and not leap before knowing. The absurd man knows simply that in that alert awareness, there is no further place for hope. Kierkegaard likewise takes the leap of faith by sacrificing the intellect, making the same move as Chestov to dissolve the first term of Camus' equation. The absurdity of this world is what assures us that there is another better world instead of being simply a residue of the experience of this world. Camus quotes Kierkegaard. In his failure, the believer finds his triumph. Camus thinks that Kierkegaard's conclusion of an afterlife does not follow from its premises. The absurd does not justify the existence of a heavenly realm. Death is the extinguishment of hope, but Kierkegaard's belief in an afterlife makes of death the goal of hope. Camus thinks that such a move transcends his skill, that is, it exceeds our ability to conceive of it. I do not want to found anything on the incomprehensible. I want to know whether I can live with what I know and with that alone, he counters. For Kierkegaard, if there is no God and no corresponding afterlife, then all we have is despair. However, seeking what is true is not seeking what is desirable. Just because we do not like what we see does not give us a license to make things up. If the choice is between illusion and despair, Camus prefers despair. He thinks that a determined soul will always manage. In recognizing the human condition of absurdity, we will find a way to cope. To substitute falsehoods and illusions the way these thinkers have done is to commit philosophical suicide, according to Camus. He clarifies that he is not judging them, but is using that term to indicate the movement by which a thought negates itself and tends to transcend itself in its very negation. Where starting from a philosophy of the world's lack of meaning, it ends up finding a meaning and adapt to it through religion. How this happens with Chestov and Kierkegaard is that thought realizes that the world is absurd. This negates the power of our reason, which is the basis of thought. But then thought makes the move to assert that there must be a transcendent God in that case. Hence, God is maintained only through the negation of human reason, observes Camus. We have to give up our ability to think, to reason, so as to reconcile the existence of God. While this move is overtly religious, Camus points to a new worship that has emerged from the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century, the religion of reason. The belief is that we can know everything through the use of our reason, which presupposes that the world is amenable to our reason. He does not elaborate on it here, but this idea runs throughout his book, with its significance captured in the first term of his equation of the absurd. Camus turns to Husserl and the phenomenologists, whose method he finds in part amenable to his own, though Husserl later makes a similar false move as Jaspers, Chestov and Kierkegaard. To recap, phenomenology's transcendental reduction suspends the act of reasoning using our preconceived notions and theories. Phenomenology declines to explain the world. It wants to be merely a description of actual experiences. It confirms absurd thought in its initial assertion that there is no truth but merely truths, explains Camus. In phenomenology, consciousness is always consciousness of something. The term for this is intentionality, where consciousness is intended or directed towards its subject. Thinking is learning all over again how to see, directing one's consciousness, making of every image a privileged place. Consciousness illuminates its object by paying attention to it. Consciousness does not form the object of its understanding. It merely focuses. It is the act of attention, adds Camus. Phenomenology as an intentional discipline whence results paradoxically a profound enrichment of experiences and the rebirth of the world in its prolixity, are absurd procedures. Instead of a diminishment from the explanations that reason provides us, the phenomenological method leads to a more acute appreciation of our experiences, constituting a new world which richness has not been reduced to some unifying scientific law. This is in line with the approach of the absurd man. This truth that comes by way of description is a psychological one and not a metaphysical one. The problem for Camus begins when one extends the phenomenological method to discover the essence of its object, otherwise known as the eidetic reduction. In contrast to Plato, who posits that there is an ideal version of an object which is the object's essence, Husserl suggests that there would be as many essences as objects. These essences are captured in each of their descriptions, such that whichever creature viewed it, be it human beings, animals, or gods, we will all get the same truth about the object. He thinks that Husserl is attempting to generalize the concrete itself, instead of taking it as what it is. How I understand the phrase is this. The usual way of generalizing is to find what is common to a species of objects, say cars. It is an abstraction. Now say there is an actual parking lot with several cars in it. Husserl tries to generalize each concrete car into a unique species of its own. In addition, Husserl asserts that even if there was no experience, the laws of science will still remain, which Camus thinks lacks evidence, since how can there be any knowledge of these laws if there was no experience to induce it from? Camus thinks Husserl is, like his predecessors, appealing to the notion that there are eternal principles governing the universe, even though the phenomenological method denies this integrating power of human reason. These philosophers all have the desire to explain the world. Camus observes that while many thinkers in his period is imbued with a philosophy of the non-significance of the world, they are divided in their conclusions. It oscillates between extreme rationalization of reality, which reduces phenomena into generalized principles, and extreme irrationalization, which explains it with religion. He thinks that both extremes are a function of rationality, wherefore what cannot be explained, to explain it with God. The absurd person, however, is at neither of these two extremes, the world being neither so rational nor so irrational. It is simply unreasonable. Reason has its limits. Beyond these limits, reason is unable to explain the world. For Kierkegaard, the intellectual desire for clarity must be given up, contrary to Camus' claim that the absurd man is lucid. Sin is not so much knowing as wanting to know, surmises Camus of Kierkegaard's position. I suspect Camus is alluding to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. What constituted their sin is not what they knew after having eaten, but for wanting to know which led them to eat of the forbidden fruit in the first place. The absurd man also wants to know, but he knows that some things are absurd and cannot be explained. In preserving this truth, his desire for knowing cannot be satisfied, but he refuses to settle for illusions. The absurd person has to live with the ailments and not seek a cure, since such a cure will involve self-deception with illusion or a surrender in the form of suicide or a renunciation of our reason. The thinkers that Camus examined had made a leap, but to Camus, making the leap is not the dangerous part. Instead, it is remaining on the edge of the precipice that is dangerous, where one has to struggle with the absurd and not escape it by deceiving oneself with illusions or surrender. The danger lies in the subtle instant that precedes the leap. Being able to remain on that dizzying crest. That is integrity, and the rest is subterfuge, he writes. Section 1.4 Absurd Freedom. Camus has established that he is unable to refute any part of his equation, neither is he able to reconcile them. He asserts that he does not know and has no way to know whether the world has a greater transcendent meaning. He can only understand things in human terms. A transcendent meaning of the world defies human terms, and hence he cannot hope for it. He can only function on the basis of whatever truths he do know, one of which is that there is a break between the world and his mind. He hence needs to preserve this truth, and can do so by being alert to it. He need not despair, but can maintain his clarity of thought and revolt against absurdity. This then transforms his perspective. This hell of the present is his kingdom at last. All problems recover their sharp edge. Abstract evidence retreats before the poetry of forms and colours. Spiritual conflicts become embodied and return to the abject and magnificent shelter of man's heart, he writes. Instead of escape through hoping for some illusory afterlife, the absurd man recognizes that the world is all there is. Instead of being confused by false hopes over how to understand and tackle his problems, he can now confront them lucidly, realizing that whatever solutions are available are only available based on what is in the world. Instead of depending on overarching principles that are unable to reduce phenomena to simple forms, he can embrace the phenomena as it appears in all its diversity and complexity. Instead of looking for comfort from religious sources when he is feeling conflicted within his soul, he must look for solutions within himself. The body, affection, creation, action, human nobility will then resume their places in this mad world, Camus writes. The absurd man will surely be tempted to make the leap to escape his true condition, but he must refuse what he cannot understand. Camus writes, what he demands of himself is to live solely with what he knows, to accommodate himself to what is, and to bring in nothing that is not certain. That is, to live without appeal to false hopes and illusions. The question has shifted beyond whether life needs to have a meaning to be lived. Camus has established that it does not. In fact, he thinks that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living an experience is accepting it fully, on all its terms, even if those terms are absurd. Suicide is just an evasion. Instead, we need to revolt against absurdity. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate, without the resignation that ought to accompany it, he elaborates. Revolt is to know that we live in an absurd world, but not despair and give up, but to be determined to thrive in it. Suicide is not an act of revolt, but the opposite. It is capitulating to the absurd instead of overcoming it. That revolt gives life its value, declares Camus. To see reality as it is, in all its absurdity, is not a cause for despair. To a man devoid of blinkers, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grip with a reality that transcends it, he adds. In this paragraph, Camus verges on the hyperbolic, using expressions like majestic, exceptional, and unequaled. How I understand it is this. It is good to see things as they are and not indulge in illusions which give us false hope. We can then act accordingly with this reality, absurd as it is, instead of leading lives impoverished by the dictates of religion in the hope of a better afterlife. The doctrines that explain everything to me also debilitate me at the same time. They relieve me of the weight of my own life, yet I must carry it alone, he writes. A religious believer's responsibility to live as good as he can seems to be taken away from him, but that is an illusion since it remains his responsibility to live as good as he can. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is a repudiation. The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter end and deplete himself. In that consciousness of the absurd, and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof of his only truth, which is defiance, writes Camus. The first consequence of being the absurd man is revolt. The second consequence is freedom. Camus is not interested to investigate whether man is free as a generality, but as individuals. To find out the former involves finding out if man has a master, which is then linked to the problem of the existence of God. However, such an investigation then becomes the problem of evil, which detracts from the problem of general freedom. Either we are not free, and God the All-Powerful is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all-powerful, he writes. In addition, Camus cannot understand what kind of freedom would be given us by a higher being. What, however, we can understand is the freedom of a prisoner or an individual who lives in a state, and our freedom of thought and action. Even if the absurd man's sincere confrontation with the absurd has denied him the illusion of religion, which means no afterlife and hence no eternal freedom, it restores and magnifies one's freedom of action. To lose hope in the future makes one more present now. Prior to admitting the absurd, a person lives with hope for the future and his actions are driven by them. He may feel like a free person, but he is enslaved by the future instead of living and acting for the current moment. However, my way of acting, as if everything has a meaning, is given a lie in vertiginous fashion by the absurdity of a possible death, he writes. To be able to make plans for the future, one has to presuppose that he has the freedom to carry out his plans. However, once he recognizes his potential death at any time, then he is not really free to carry out his plans, since death can stop him. To the extent to which he imagined a purpose to his life, he adapted himself to the demands of a purpose to be achieved and became the slave of his liberty, writes Camus. We force ourselves into our targeted roles, which we learn by looking at others in those roles, his examples being father, engineer, leader, and clerk. So we are not really free. I create for myself barriers between which I confine my life, he adds. Instead, the absurd man, by not being bogged down with hopes for the future, is free, released from the demands of trying to achieve goals and the social convention of such roles. He contrasts the religious person with slaves, who since they did not belong to themselves are not entirely responsible for themselves, and hence may feel free in that way, but such freedom is not liberty. The inevitability of death, while crushing, is also liberating. Because of our limited time to live, it focuses our minds on living while we still have life. We live in an absurd world where nothing is possible but everything is given. With an indifference to the future, we can have instead a desire to use up everything that is given. Belief in the meaning of life always implies a scale of values, a choice, or preferences. Belief in the absurd teaches the contrary, he writes. If we think that there is a meaning for us, say our purported purpose in life is to become a doctor, then we will privilege going to medical school over, say, learning to dive. And if we fail to achieve that, we would feel that we are having a lower quality of life. Having abandoned the future and with it value judgments and the choices such values will have us choose, Camus surmises that the absurd man will instead substitute the quantity of experiences for the quality. What counts is not the best living, but the most living, according to Camus, since the best living will be measured in terms of our values and goal fulfillment, which has been abandoned by the absurd man. To be fulfilled, what one can then do is to get as many experiences as he can with his allotted time on earth, to experience what life has to offer as much as possible. To do so, one needs to be faced with the world as often as possible. How much experience one can get is related to one's length of life, so one should avoid premature death. How long one lives after taking the necessary precautions is then a matter of luck. However, it is not just the length of life, but our consciousness of our experiences. Being aware of one's life, one's revolt, one's freedom, and to the maximum, is living, and to the maximum, he adds. To taste as deeply as we can of our experiences, we need to be fully aware of them, to be in the moment while experiencing them. The present and the succession of presence before a constantly conscious soul is the ideal of the absurd man, he writes. This is the third consequence of being the absurd man, to live consciously and in that way passionately. Camus sums it up. The existence of the absurd has three consequences for us: my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. The absurd, which might at first seem like an invitation to death via suicide, instead gives us grounds to live, and to live as much as we can. I avoid saying living well as it implies goals and achievements, though living by gathering plenty of experiences is also part of living well. As Camus wrote in a footnote, quantity sometimes constitute quality. He cites Nietzsche. It clearly seems that the chief thing in heaven and on earth is to obey at length and in a single direction. In the long run, there results something for which it is worth the trouble of living on this earth. As for example, virtue, art, music, the dance, reason, the mind. Something that transfigures, something delicate, mad, or divine. Calling it a code of ethics and also the way of the absurd man. He seems to be suggesting that even though the absurd man has no goals except to accumulate experiences, something valuable can result from it nonetheless. At this point in the essay, he does not substantiate why that is the case. Instead, he returns to talk about religion. A lot of this chapter is devoted to combating the religious attitude. This to me is tiresome and repetitive since I feel it has been settled. But clearly the religious influence must have been an important force in his time, such that he felt he needed to repeatedly defend his views against it. According to Camus, the leap of faith itself is absurd, and hence, far from resolving the paradox of our absurd world, it reinstates it. Moreover, religion presents one specific perspective. Camus thinks that it is hard to be satisfied with a single way of seeing. Religion defines a way of thinking. But the point is to live, he writes. To Camus, the religious attitude is an impediment to living abandonedly, to accumulating as many experiences as possible. Thank you. To support the Philosophical Bachelor, you can do so at worldwideweb.patreon.com/philosophicalbachelor.